Welcome back into the 14, our Thursday edition. Blake Lovell, Barry Allen with me. Gentlemen, we got a lot to talk about, and we're going to hit basketball first and then hit into some SEC tournament scenarios for that event, which, boy, that's going to be complicated. And then we'll get into some baseball. Hope you guys are well. Blake, I'm going to start by throwing it to you. 2 games last night. Thank God we finally got to see A&M play. We saw Missouri get a big win that I think has clinched the Tigers a berth in the NCAA tournament. Let's start with that one. What were your impressions of Florida and Missouri last night, Blake?
Well, we decided to rank Dru Smith number 4 in our top 14 player rankings for the season. I think he made us look pretty good in terms of how he played in that game. I thought he was just fantastic in terms of some of the things he did. Certainly the game-winning reverse layup was a big part of that, but he had 9 assists, 6 steals, 17 points. This guy, and that's what we talked about when we did that episode, was just, man, this guy can just do a little bit of everything, and he's kind of showed that last night, and he's one of the most valuable players in the entire league at this point. I wouldn't even be against moving him up a spot or 2 potentially on our list. Like, I just think this guy just kind of showed last night what we've talked about all season with him. But really, they just had a lot of balance for Missouri, like just such a balanced scoring effort. I know Jeremiah Tillman fouled out late, but once again, like he made a big difference just in terms of some of the things he did. I thought Trey Mann on the other side, once again, he's someone we had ranked very highly in our rankings, and he played well. But that's a significant win for Missouri, because that's what we kept talking about. They were the one that just really started sliding down, and I think that was actually a good probably outcome maybe for the SEC, because I started to wonder if Florida wasn't putting itself in a better position than Missouri may be, and with a couple losses, maybe Missouri starts sliding a bit. Although, as we talked about, their remaining schedule, they've still got LSU, so it's not like they're going to run into a bad loss unless they lose to someone in the SEC tournament that's considered a bad loss. So really good win for Missouri. I thought that, they didn't finish great, but you know what? At this time of year, it doesn't matter. You just need to win, and that was probably one of their better wins in a while.
There was a point in that game last night where I think Florida was down 8 late, like in the last 2 minutes. Maybe it was 6, but I remember Jeremiah Tillman gets the ball on the right block and just has to turn and hit a layup that he hits probably at least 95 times out of 100, missed it pretty badly. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if he just put his head down for a minute or moped or got caught up in the traffic. But next thing you know, Colin Castleton's sprinting to the other end of the floor and getting a dunk or a layup easily. And it's a 4-point swing just like that. And I'm thinking at that point, because Florida comes back and ties it, but when that happened, I'm thinking, okay, Florida's going to take this now. But Missouri was really resilient. And to play with Dru Smith, he gets the ball on the right wing, and I don't remember who was guarding it, if it was Mann or who, but the defender's kind of shading him. That might be a little harsh, but certainly Smith just made one move, blew by his guy, and beat 3 guys for layup using the rim to kind of protect himself against a couple of shot blockers back there in Castleton and DeRuggi. But a couple of big momentum swings in that final minute. And I thought after Tillman missed that layup and then they give up an easy one on the other end, that it was going to go the Gators' way.
Yeah, no, I thought it was just like you talked about that play where I don't remember who it was, came to set the screen for Dru Smith, and he went the other way. I think you saw some of those guys, the Florida guys, had the momentum going the other way, thinking he's going to use the screen, and he went the opposite direction, and like you said, kind of protected himself by going to the opposite side and using the layup on that side. But yeah, it was a weird game in terms of how it played out, with just kind of like you said, sort of the swings late. Castleton made some big plays, but I think overall, man, just to me, we've talked about Missouri and just the big wins they've got this season. They've also lost some games they shouldn't have lost. But like that's just they bring you back in with games like that, because you see what kind of balance they can have. And then we talk about with Dru Smith, who, by the way, we put out a poll on our Twitter account yesterday at 14 Southeastern about, make your pick for SEC Player of the Year. We got about 500 votes on that. And Herbert Jones obviously was the one that got most of the votes. But a lot of people picked other, because we put our top 3 in there, which was Herbert Jones, Moses Moody and Cam Thomas. A lot of people picked other and replied with Dru Smith. So Missouri fans weighing in, but they certainly got their money's worth from him in this win at Florida.
I think they've got a case because we kind of decided, I don't know, we had so many things to talk about on that podcast. We sort of just said, okay, it's probably going to be Herb Jones unless we find a reason not to. I don't know if that sums up our thinking really well, but I don't know that we explored opening up that one spot. But I think we might, and I do think that Dru Smith, because I don't know that we really entertained the notion that he could be player of the year, but I think that might be worth an exploration. I still think it's going to be Herb Jones. I was looking at a comparison with he and Moody last night, and I still think if it's a two-man argument, I still think Jones wins. Although it's interesting, win shares over at College Basketball Reference has Moody really way out in front at this point. Again, I don't know what really goes into that calculation, but it's interesting. But I think they might be right. I think that Dru Smith probably at least should get a mention in that discussion, maybe. I don't know that the win shares and some other systems really like him, but you look at what he does on paper, and you see that coupled with the fact that he is their go-to guy. I think he is their MVP. I think he's a guy that if you take out, I don't think they're an NCAA tournament team, and I think that matters too.
Well, and technically, here's the thing. I think if Missouri has a better finish, I think we'd probably be pushing that conversation a lot more. Fair or unfair, I just think that's the way it is. Because technically, right, they can finish 8-8 in the league. They can finish at 500 if they lose this game to LSU. And I think in that scenario, you're going to look at the team up there in Alabama who has the potential to finish 16-2 versus maybe the team with the player that finishes 8-8. So I think that's just sort of a natural thinking part of this. But like you said, if you do dive a bit deeper, which I think is initially what we did, like we probably put Dru Smith higher on our list than I would say, many people probably would, just because I don't think the guy gets enough credit for what he does, and he kind of showed what he can do in that game last night. So I don't think there's any doubt. Like he's in that discussion. Like I said, we put Cam Thomas up there. I know we were kind of split on that, but like you can certainly make the argument. I think that you could put Dru Smith in that top three, and you could even make that argument. I think ESPN actually did that last night. They showed the stats, I think, side by side of Dru Smith and Herbert Jones, which I want to point out, like, that's just a statistical thing. Like, I think there's a lot more that goes into it, but like when you look at the stats and how they compare, like Smith scores more. He does some of the things that Herbert Jones does, but like I said, I think the one thing that differentiates them is the fact that you've got an Alabama team that's potentially going to go 16-2 in the league versus a Missouri team that could go 9-7, could go 8-8, and maybe that's just one of the things that plays into it.
Well, I think Missouri is probably clinched the dance invite now. I mean, I guess, let's see, Missouri has got on Saturday.
Yeah, they've got LSU. Someone brought that up on Twitter. That's as if Missouri could lose that game and then lose in the tournament and then maybe be out. I don't see that scenario in any way, shape, or form. So
I think it's unlikely. And that game, okay, that game's in Columbia, so a loss there maybe hurts you a little bit more. But Missouri's got 7 quad one wins now.
Yeah.
And I just think once you get to bubble teams and you start comparing them, that's going to win. I think that I'd be shocked if Missouri doesn't get in now. And ironically, Florida, I think, would be a seed line ahead of Missouri right now or two on most projections. But I think it seems to me like if the discussion is one of these teams clinched, even though Missouri's lower, I think once you start diving into the things that get a team in the tournament, Missouri's got a little better case. And I think Florida probably in two, even if it loses out, especially with one of those games in Knoxville. Both of them, I think, are probably in, but I think especially Missouri at this point.
LSU is the only team I could see a potential scenario, which even then, because they play Missouri, I don't know how much that hurts them if they lose that game. And then you're really only talking about one game in the SEC tournament. So I don't see any of these teams falling out. Like I saw that discussion on Twitter about, well, maybe the SEC, maybe one of these teams drops out. I think LSU is the only potential team, but I think you would need a lot of other teams elsewhere to push bubble bid, like just completely steal bids elsewhere and all this other stuff to even push LSU, I think, to that point. Because right now in bracket matrix, they're the second 9 seed, and like I said, they're playing Missouri on Saturday. And that's not, like, that loss is not going to drop them to an 11 line all of a sudden. So I think I really don't see any of these. I think these 6 are in, and It's just a matter of seeing could someone else win the SEC tournament and grab a seventh. But I think these six are in.
Well, it wasn't a terribly entertaining game in College Station last night, but at least it was a game, and that's a good start with A&M. Um, Mississippi State wins another game on the road. I thought Molinar and Stewart were pretty good for them. Dru Smith was having a good night, did some things like assists that don't usually show up for him. I think for A&M, my regret is we didn't get to see more of Emmanuel Miller this year because that kid's really a player.
Yeah, he is. I mean, he's someone that I think, like you said, it's so strange to watch that game last night, and like you're trying to remember all the little tendencies for some of these guys, but it's like these guys haven't played in a month or so, and you're trying to think, well, what did we see from Texas A&M the last time they played that game against Kansas State? I don't even remember. Like it has been so long, and we've seen so many games since then. But he was really good in that one. I mean, that's the thing is, you know. We're probably having a discussion on some of those Texas A&M guys if they play a full season, in terms of just looking around and saying, hey, maybe this guy deserves to be in there. Savion Flagg, someone, and that's what I hate about the whole thing is, you've got guys like that on this roster that are seniors like that, and it's like, man, they lose a month of their season. It's just, I don't know. Like there's things like that. As I watched this game, I was just thinking, my goodness, what a different year it could have been for the Aggies. But this game played out about it how you expected. We always say the teams that have these long pauses, the data shows that they come in at a disadvantage. Texas A&M started out okay, but I think they pointed out on commentary they just kind of hit that wall late, and I don't think that was much of a surprise given how long it's been since they've actually played a game.
Let's go into SEC tournament scenarios. Okay, I'm looking at this, and I think at this point, okay, we know that the 12-13 is going to be one of Vanderbilt, Texas A&M, or South Carolina. And those teams are all in contention for 11-13. We know at the top that it's going to be Alabama in the 1, and we know that it's going to be Arkansas in the 2. Everything else in the middle is jumbled. I think it's down to LSU and Tennessee for the 3 seed. I believe that Tennessee can't get the 3. In fact, I know it can't. The 4 can be LSU, Tennessee, or LSU. And I think at that point, that's the discussion for the 4. I don't think anybody else can get in that outside those 3 can grab those top 2.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how it works in terms of what you're looking at with some of these. Like we said, I thought last night would give us a little bit more clarity in terms of how those games played out. But I think that's kind of the scenarios where it stands, which I think the fact is, and we talked about this when they brought the schedule in terms of the makeup schedule and all that, it was good that you had Florida, Tennessee, LSU, Missouri all playing, each other in different games, because I think that was going to give you a little bit more clarity too, not just on the NCAA tournament seeding and just avoiding, bad losses, but also they're those teams that are grouped in together right there behind Alabama and Arkansas. So it's depending on how these games turn out, we will know. But I'm glad it kind of worked out that way, because then that's going to make it a little bit easier depending on who win those 2 games, Florida, Tennessee, and LSU and Missouri on Saturday.
Missouri can't sneak into the first game, can it? I think that's already been ruled out.
Which game?
Yeah,
I don't think they're.
Missouri could go 10-7. LSU's already at 10-7. That game would decide that between those 2 teams. I think it's down to, boy, this just gets confusing because you've got right now, goodness, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 teams between 7 and 10 wins.
Yeah, that's a mess.
I mean, I intended today that we would go into the tournament seedings, but I don't know that this is something that we can easily decipher right now. Let's see.
It's not. Trust me, it's not. I've tried. It's like I said, last night gave us a little more clarity in terms of what the scenarios would be heading into Saturday, but it still didn't give us much clarity in terms of where people are actually going to be seated. A lot of it's going to depend on Saturday's games. So.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll just table that discussion till then. But anything else out of the Mississippi State A&M game that you took away from? I didn't take a lot away. Again, I thought that we talked about State, and that was kind of the team that in our 14 got the short end of the stick, because I think there were three guys that entered the conversation: Dru Smith, Iverson Molinar, and DJ Stewart, who maybe, in fact, if you went 15-20, right, you might have all three of those guys in there. In fact, I think there's a decent chance you would. That's a team that I thought, they've been inconsistent at times, and I thought it was a little bit easier going into College Station last night to win, given how long they've been off. But it's never easy on the road. And, I mean, State's now won 8 games in the league. I think that you thought that was maybe the 13th, 12th best team in the league going into the year. So I would say where that bar of expectations was set, that team's had a really nice season.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I go back and forth on them because then I think about it, I'm like, they beat Florida, but it's like, aside from that, like, I don't know. Like, some of these teams at the bottom, as we've talked about, they're just not very good. And I don't know. Like, I'm not taking anything away from Mississippi State because they are better than I thought they would be. I don't know. Like, even that game last night, I'm looking up and thinking, I don't know. Like, Texas A&M's been off for a month, and I can't say that I'm shocked in terms of just being an ugly type of game. But they have. I mean, Mississippi State's won more games than I thought they would, and we've talked about it too. Like, that's a young group. Like, he's got a bunch of sophomores, and in that rotation, aside from Abdul Adu, the senior, like everyone else is pretty young. So I think that's something to keep in mind too with them. And we expect it to be kind of maybe a down season for them, but I think overall. Yeah, they're just kind of one of those teams that I think you look at and they're going to give you, I think some matchup problems at times just because of their size. And Ben Howland's always had size there. That's something he's recruited well in terms of getting guys in there that are just long and athletic and all that. So that they're good enough to give you fits, I think, just with their size and those kind of things and athleticism. But at the same time, I don't know. Like they're one of those teams that I think we could pull out of a hat heading into the SEC tournament and say, I could maybe see that team winning 2 games, and I could also see that team, losing to Texas A&M in a scenario like that. So,
okay, I'm going to give you a little defense of State here. State has beaten Missouri. It has beaten Florida. It got a blowout win at Iowa State, which I don't know that counts for much. It's beaten Ole Miss. So, yeah, I mean, it has picked off some games against the underbelly of the league. And it did lose on its home floor to Vanderbilt very badly recently. But you also look at the league, and it's not like the teams at the bottom are just awful. And Ole Miss, good example. Ole Miss is a pretty experienced team. You've got kids like Devontae Shuler and Romello White who have played a lot of college basketball. Ole Miss goes into Vandy this weekend without Vandy's best 2 players and gets beat. So, and Ole Miss is a lot more experienced. MSU is 312 and Ken Palm and experience. So I would say you build in an expectation that there's going to be some rocky moments. And I think given how young this team is, I think 8 wins for Ben Howland is a pretty big victory.
Yeah, I mean, look, they're ahead of Kentucky and South Carolina. Those are 2 teams I would have picked to be ahead of Mississippi State for sure. But, you could have made the argument that they could have, finished ahead of teams like Georgia and Auburn. I was probably lower on Auburn than most people were heading into the season just because of the inexperience. And then, A&M and Vanderbilt, I think we all kind of projected to be, in that bottom 4 probably in the league. So, no, and that's what you said. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from them. I think maybe my expectations for the league as a whole were too high, and maybe I'm not giving the league enough credit because it's very strange to think I'm usually the one that gives the league maybe more credit than I should. But I just think some of these teams have been so inconsistent this year that it's been so hard to figure out what to make of really anyone outside of Alabama and Arkansas at this point. And that's not saying that some of these teams aren't good, because as we said, we're going to see 6 teams in the tournament probably. But it's been frustrating at times to try to know what you're getting from some of these teams. So I think when you just have that inconsistency everywhere, like you said, it's better to have 8 wins than 7 or 6 and on down the line. So yes, Mississippi State, and there had been a lot of talk heading into the season. I mean, Mississippi State fans have been frustrated in terms of thinking that program should be taking a next step, and they don't feel like they have because they had that 5 seed or whatever a couple seasons ago. They lost to Liberty in the first round, and so I feel like Mississippi State fans came in a little frustrated. I don't know that this changes a whole lot just because, they aren't going to make the NCAA tournament, but I don't think that was ever the expectation. So,
Well, a couple of interesting things. The bottom two teams in the Big Ten are maybe worse than any two in the SEC. Certainly, that's the case in the Big 12, where Kansas State and Iowa State are having historically bad years for those teams. So,
yeah.
I do think I think that I think our frustration with the league, I think this sums it up. We'd have liked to seen Tennessee be a 1 or a 2 or a 3 like we hoped, right? We would have liked to seen Florida maybe taken that early January momentum where they were playing so well and translate that into a 3. I think our frustration is some of these teams that are 6 and 7, we were hoping would be 2, 3, and 4. Meanwhile, Arkansas, I think, has exceeded everybody's expectations. Alabama certainly has. And then you have a team like Missouri that's played its way into the tournament, where I don't think that a lot of people expected that at the beginning of the season. I think if you swap some teams up and maybe you make Tennessee and Florida what Arkansas and Alabama are, and then you say Alabama and Arkansas are 6 and 7 seeds, which would have been maybe sort of surprising to most people. Then you say Missouri has slipped in. I don't know if this is fair to say it, and maybe it's an oversimplification, but I wonder if you just change around the teams and the seeds, and all of a sudden you're thinking the SEC is going to have a 1 or 2 seed. You just think it's going to be Tennessee and not Alabama. I wonder if you change the names around with the seeds, if that doesn't maybe reshape the way we think about the league. And, oh, by the way, if Vandy is going to be top 100 in KenPom, which I think it's right at 100 today, and that Georgia's going to win 7 games, if all those things going in, set against the bar of expectations where it was, does that change the way that you view the league?
I mean, I think you're right about the frustration with teams like Tennessee because, and I think their inconsistency hasn't helped. But then you know what? Well, Kentucky too, and we mentioned that. But I still think if you replace them, we've already talked about I already look at Alabama and Arkansas as potential Final Four type teams with how they played. And so if you replace them with Tennessee and Kentucky, I don't know that it changes all that much just based on terms of how these teams have played. Maybe it's just sort of that mess in the middle, which we always talk about. It happens every season. We always talk about those teams that are right there in the middle that you can't get a good feel on. And I think this season, just the different nature of the season, I don't think this should have been that unexpected in terms of knowing there were going to be some teams that were probably going to be more disappointing than you thought, just based on not having an off season, having long pauses, 2-week pauses, whatever, throughout this season. So I think that really does play a large part in this. I don't think we can undervalue that at all in terms of seeing how that's kind of turned out, not just in the SEC, but all throughout the country with certain teams. So I think that's one of the things. And I will also add then that I think Florida and LSU are 2 of those sort of infuriating type teams at times where you just look at them on paper and you think that they should be maybe those top 4 type seeds in the tournament. And then they just kind of, they lose some games that they shouldn't lose. They win some games maybe that you don't think they're going to win. And so I think it's that middle group where you feel like 1 and 2 in the SEC is really, really strong this season. But I think 3, 4, 5, 6, it's just sometimes you feel pretty good about them. Sometimes you don't. And I just think that's a little different than I keep using that season from whatever it was, 18-19, where you had LSU, Kentucky, Tennessee, Auburn, all those teams were near the 30-win mark. And, it's just that was sort of a different type of feel. In Mississippi State, that's when they were the 5 seed. That was a different type of season. And so I think when you compare it to recent history, this is one where you do have 2 potential Final Four teams at the top in Bama and Arkansas. But I think everyone else is just, they've been so hard to figure it out. And I think a product of that just is sort of the circumstances surrounding this season.
All right, let's bring in Barry Allen, who has waited patiently and silently for a few minutes here. Barry, lots of midweek baseball around the conference. Pretty good week for the SEC. What stands out to you, good, bad, or indifferent so far in the midweek?
Well, in the midweek, just some good games. I think, I saw Alabama in person yesterday play against Troy, 2 7-1 teams getting together. I thought Alabama played probably its best game of the year. They had a 6-run inning in the second inning, 7 consecutive hits. Sam Prater and Zane Denton hit back-to-back home runs in that inning. Payton Wilson led the game off again with a home run. It's his 3rd leadoff homer of the year. Saw his parents after the game. We were comparing him to Ricky Henderson and all the leadoff homers and laughing about that. But I think the real thing that stood out yesterday was, Connor Shamblin and Will Freeman, 2 guys that's been around a while but haven't really established themselves on the mound, pitched extremely well. Gave up 1 run, struck out 8 combined, did not walk a hitter, which I thought was a really positive thing for them. Only 1 Troy base runner reached second base, and that was Logan Cerny, the gentleman who hit the home run in the 6th inning. No other Troy player reached second base in the game, and I thought that was a positive step for Alabama yesterday. And as they get ready to go to Charleston this weekend to face the College of Charleston, and also I think LSU day-night doubleheader yesterday with Nicholls State and Southern. 6 home runs in the 2 games, another walk-off win for LSU. LSU's power numbers are really, really starting to take off. Looking like they're going to be a really, prolific home run hitting team. They've already hit 21 home runs in 9 games. They've now surpassed South Carolina, for the league lead in home runs. So you've always associated LSU with power, and that's what it looks like we're seeing from LSU, in the early stages of the season.
Barry, we talked a little bit pre-podcast about Florida, and you look at the SEC, and again, I will emphasize that schedules are very disparate this time of the year. So, there's a big difference in terms of what teams like Arkansas, Mississippi State played, say, versus Kentucky. And I would also include Florida in that, right? Because the Gators played a weekend series with Miami to open. That's a ranked team. That's never going to be easy. The schedule down there in Florida, all those teams that you play in the midweek, I mean, at a place like a Vandy or Kentucky, you're maybe playing some OVC teams, or not that the Horizon League is bad, but some teams for that, or the Missouri Valley. Not that those are bad teams, but they're not the Florida Atlantics and the Stetsons and some of the teams that you may run into by virtue of being in Florida. So with that, knowing that the Gators maybe play a little tougher midweek slate, and of course started with that Miami series, still Florida #1 preseason. I think it lost 1 game all last year, has basically the same bunch coming back that started, I think, 16-1 last season before the season was called. And looking at the way it is happening, right? The Gators having trouble scoring runs at times, the bullpen really having trouble throwing strikes and closing people out. Very, very early, but I think we both expected better out of Florida so far.
Yeah, and I think one thing you allude to with their schedule, there's a lot of advantages for living in the state of Florida, and there are a lot of disadvantages for living in the state of Florida because your midweek travel are teams from Florida. And if you look at Florida's schedule, 50 of their games come against SEC teams or teams from the state of Florida. So their RPI schedule-wise is going to be better than everyone else's, or a little higher than most teams, just simply because of the nature of, the teams they're playing. North Florida, they won 2 games from them last week, not a bad club. FAU's, has been to the NCAA tournament in the past. The game last night, it's 2-1 Florida in the 3rd inning, and they'll score another run and lose in the 10th inning to FAU. And that happens in the midweek sometimes, but just look at their schedule. I mean, I think they'll get well this weekend. They have, 3 at home with Florida A&M, but the Gators are, hitting .301 as a team. I think the one thing that stands out for you on the Gators is their earned run average. They are 13th in the league in ERA at 4.19. Only Missouri is worse at 8.35, so almost 4 runs a game. Florida's not a power hitting team. They never really have been. They've hit 9 home runs, but 7 of those have come from Judd Fabian and Nathan Hickey. So they don't have a lot of power outside of those guys. Jacob Young has been really good to start the year for them. Leads their team in hitting, has played really well, for them throughout the course of the season. Has a 27-game hitting streak. Hits 395 for the year, 8 RBIs. Hitting streak dates back to the 2019 College World Series. So he's been consistent for them. Fabian has power, 4 homers, 12 RBIs, but he's only hitting 237. So he's kind of he has 9 hits. He has 5 singles and 4 home runs. And, he's 5 for 34 if you take out his homers. So he struggled, preseason All-American, All-Conference guy. He struggled, with the bat. Just probably try to get things going for them. I think they would like to pitch better. Their weekend guys seem to be, pretty well. Hunter Minks pitched well out of the bullpen, but Tommy Mace, is an 0.82 ERA as a Friday guy. Jack Leftwich 3.37 in 2 starts, 10 innings, but only 8 strikeouts and 4 walks. Garrett Milchin is 2 starts, but he hasn't had a decision. Hunter Barco's had 2 starts, but his ERA is north of 11. So I think if they can get their starting pitching and level out the bullpen, they're going to play good teams, and I think they'll be the Florida that we expect when the season's over. They just maybe have a little bit of a disadvantage of, playing those Florida teams that are really good, as opposed to, bringing in northern teams, that can drive a few hours, like maybe Kentucky, Vandy, some of those others can play, but it just the nature of their schedule.
One thing that stands out a little bit, Florida's given up 9 home runs, which is most in the league. Well, yes, it is most in the league. I know the old ballpark was home run favorable at times. Any feel on whether what's going on down there with giving up the gopher ball is a pitching staff thing, or is that just the way that park's going to play, or do we even know yet?
I think it's too early to tell. The weather. I mean, obviously the weather in Florida is better than it is, pretty much everywhere else. Although we are anticipating a balmy 72 degrees in Tuscaloosa today, which is a far cry from where we've been the last few weeks, but still better off than most places with ice and snow, because we haven't had that. But I think it's a combination of, early in the season, I don't think we really have a true gauge of how their park will play, playing Miami at home. I know they played Samford this past weekend and did a very good job beating Samford, good team, held their power hitters down the first 2 nights. But I think Carlson and Sonny DeShera hit 3 home runs on Sunday. I know DeShera hit 2 and was OVC SoCon player of the week, even though Samford lost at Florida because he hit 2 home runs, 2 big home runs in the game against the Gators. So it may be a little bit different with that park. I know the old park, pop-ups to right field could put a lot of runs on the board because it really jetted out of there. So I think it's still early, but it'd be something to keep an eye on during the season is, if this park plays smaller and there's more home runs.
Barry, one thing that's becoming a trend at all levels of baseball is more strikeouts. I'm looking at the stats through Wednesday night. You've already got 4 teams in the league that have, from the pitching side, struck out over 100 hitters. A&M leads the way at 131, followed by Ole Miss at 123, Mississippi State at 111, and LSU at 100. State's only done it in 72 innings, and Ole Miss at 79. But, boy, the arms in the state of Mississippi right now in particular are really impressive.
Yeah, they have been. Mississippi State struck out 20 last night in the win over Southern Miss. In fact, I wrote in the blog for today, I'm trying to call it up real quick on that. Their bullpen last night was lights out, and the Stone, who ended up getting the save, he struck out the side in the 9th, and the pitcher before him struck out all 6 batters. All 6 of his outs were strikeouts as well. So they put up a lot of numbers, striking out, a lot of players, a lot of opposing hitters, and have pitched really well. The walks have seemed to come down a little bit for Mississippi State. That's helped. Ole Miss the other night in their win over Memphis the other night, their bullpen pitched 4 perfect innings, 12 up and 12 down, and pitched really well in that game as well. So a lot of strikeouts, for some pitching staffs. I know A&M was leading the league in strikeouts after the first week of the season. Ole Miss at 123, as you mentioned, and A&M at 131. Just, a lot of power arms, from those teams. But, Mississippi State, real impressive, talking about last night, with 20 strikeouts. They're most in a game since 2002. So you're almost talking 20 years, since they put up numbers like that on the mound. But they look like they're going to be a strikeout type team. Their walks were a little bit high early in the year, but coming down a little bit over the course of the last few games, and looking to improve on that.
Barry, I want to ask you, we're not even quite 2 full weeks in, and crazy stuff happens early. Has a lot stood out to you as surprising, good or bad, within the league? I mean, I don't have a lot that's glaring. Florida, in my mind, would have started better than I thought. I think Kentucky's 6-0 start and the way it has done it, and again, soft schedule, so who knows, is a thing that stands out a little bit. I'd hope Missouri would be better. I think Missouri looks like the one bad team in the league, and I think the other 13 are going to be pretty solid, if not good. But maybe I have unfairly taken some things off the table there for you. But because, again, this comes against the backdrop of a season last year that was shortened. We use that to frame expectations. Well, the whole conference season wasn't played. So that was at the point where we were going to start being able to make critical evaluations, and that entire thing got pulled out from under us. So with that, knowing it is tough to frame expectations and know what fair expectations are, give me some things that maybe have not been what you expected, good or bad.
Well, obviously Kentucky being undefeated at this point, 6-0, but you have to take into account their opening weekend series at North Carolina was canceled due to COVID for Kentucky. So if they go and play that series, probably not 6-0 at this point, but they play the schedule that they play, and that's where they are for that. I think Ole Miss losing a series at home to Central Florida last week was a little bit surprising. I think maybe the power numbers that South Carolina and LSU have put up, 19 and 21, they've hit 40 home runs combined this year. I think that's probably a higher number than most people anticipated. I know for LSU, it's the most home runs they've hit through 9 games in almost 20 years, and rivaling the 9-game total of the Gorilla Ball era of 1997. And certainly nobody's going to think that Wes Clark's going to hit 600 through the first few games of the season. Although Tuesday night, Winthrop learned how to pitch him. Gave up 3 home runs to him last week and held him to his first hitless game of the year Tuesday night, walked him twice. And I think some of the younger players for Vanderbilt, Keegan now leading the league in hitting, as Clark went 0 for 3 the other night, some of the things that kind of stand out, maybe some teams losing some games, midweek games or home games on the weekend, maybe Tennessee not finishing off Indiana State. You mentioned Missouri, they've played 2 4-game series with Grand Canyon and Omaha. Had struggled at Grand Canyon, got 1 game, split with Omaha 2-2 in 4 video game type scores, 12-10, 17-11, 10-1, and 9-3. That sounds like the 80s and 90s again. And they'll be tested again this week. They've got Dallas Baptist, Oklahoma, and Arizona. Dallas Baptist twice, and Oklahoma and Arizona at a tournament in Frisco starting tonight. So their non-conference schedule has been difficult. Played to Omaha at home, but they're looks like there's 4, 8, 9 of their first 13 are on the road, and they host Illinois State at home next week before opening on the road in the conference. So that's some of the things that's kind of stood out with some of the teams and early part in the midweeks as we get closer and closer to conference play.
Barry, this weekend, you kind of mentioned some of the series coming up. I'm just looking around at the schedule and kind of looking ahead. You talked about Missouri and kind of what they have coming up and some of the others, but is there anything maybe, I don't know, under the radar or just something that kind of catches your eye about one of these series or something you really have your eye on with some of these SEC teams, maybe just based on the matchups heading into this weekend?
Well, this weekend in SEC baseball kind of reminds me of the weekend before Thanksgiving in football. There's just not a lot of just not a lot of meat on the bones this weekend for, some of these teams. And I understand that teams are trying to play, RPIs or maybe just trying to, load up, get some wins early in the season. As we look at the schedule, there are two things that have happened in this week that has altered this schedule a little bit. Auburn is no longer playing Xavier, and Mississippi State is no longer playing Tennessee Tech. Why, you ask? Well, there is COVID issues. Xavier has paused their baseball activities because of COVID. So Auburn has lost a weekend series. Tennessee Tech has paused their their baseball activities. So Mississippi State has lost Tennessee Tech. So Butch Thompson and Chris Lamona's, as baseball coaches can be, get creative, go out, try to find some games. Well, Kent State, who played Tennessee Tech last week, is supposed to go to West Virginia this week, but West Virginia's on pause. So Kent State's looking for a game, and Chris Lamona's hooks up with Kent State. So now Kent State is coming to Starkville this weekend. By the way, you'll all be tested on this later. And Boston College was supposed to go to Wake Forest, but Wake Forest has COVID issues, so they're no longer going to Wake Forest. Boston College is now coming to Auburn this week. So you got to be creative. And so maybe the Boston College Auburn might be a little intriguing just because they found out Wednesday they're going to play each other this week. But that shows, now we've had 3 SEC series affected in the first 3 weeks by COVID. I thought going into this week, only 1 out of 3 weeks would be pretty good. But now we've had 3, affected by it. So we'll see how that goes on as the season runs along, but certainly something that, teams have to be aware of. Just looking at some of the games, Ball State's at Kentucky. I think Ball State's a pretty good club. I know 2 years ago they had a first rounder on the mound. He's gone now, but I think that would be an interesting series between Ball State and Kentucky. And I think, Chris, you probably know this better than anybody, but this might be the 1,000th year in a row that Vanderbilt's hosted Illinois, Chicago in Nashville or played them somewhere. That's not a bad club out of the Horizon League, and it's them or Wright State in the NCAA tournament every year. Alabama going to the College of Charleston, will be a good road test for Alabama, the first time they've been out of state, this year. And New Mexico State going to Texas A&M. I think, A&M's had some issues. It looks like they've, played well this week and kind of rebounded, winning 4 of their last 5. But New Mexico State can hit, and we'll see how that goes in College Station this weekend. Really good offensive club in the Aggies from New Mexico State that'll face a good pitching staff from A&M that leads the league in strikeouts.
Barry, at any point in your life, did anyone ever suggest to you that you had a future in air traffic control?
No, they didn't. But I guess you're talking about trying to juggle all those teams around. I got dizzy.
Yes.
I got dizzy.
I did too.
All that. I mean, I was at the Alabama game and I ran into Danny Watkins, who's a scout for the Boston Red Sox. He used to work at Alabama when I was there, and we were talking, catching up. His son played at Hillcrest High School here in Tuscaloosa, and then played at Army. Was an all-conference player at Army, and has worked for the Red Sox since his career ended as a player. And we were just kind of talking about teams, and he goes, "We heard about Auburn." And I said, "No, what happened?" He goes, "Well, they're playing Boston College." I go, "Well, what happened to Xavier?" He said, "Well, they have COVID." I said, "Well, who was Boston College supposed to play?" And he goes, "Well, Wake Forest, but they got COVID, so they couldn't play." So I spent about an hour just last night when I got home just digging up, well, who paused and who didn't, and it was crazy. Just West Virginia, so their opponent moves here, and it was just crazy trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together to seemed like who made this schedule, but it seemed like Auburn and Mississippi State did a pretty good job, and they're going to play and they're not going to miss a beat. And I guess one interesting thing is that Kent State playing at Mississippi State played Tennessee Tech last week, and Tennessee Tech's the one that had COVID. So you wonder if Kent State's going to come up with that maybe after this series, and then there's problems at Mississippi State as well. So you just cross your fingers and hope everything goes well, and we can get all the games in that we can.
Barry, I will hit on one thing that you brought up. Dominick Keegan at Vanderbilt. I've seen him play a lot this year, and that was a lineup that going in to the season, they felt like they had some talent. And of course, Vanderbilt always does, right? But last year was the year to sort of reset after losing Blade and Martin and Steven Scott and all those guys. And then they lose Harrison Ray and Ty Duvall, who didn't come back for a fifth year. So they're turning over almost their whole lineup. And Keegan was a kid who in 2019, I think that they thought coming into the season, even as a true freshman, was a good enough hitter that he might sneak into a role even with all that talent. Well, it didn't go well for him. Last year, he gets a blood clot that almost threatened his baseball career and frankly, his life. And he came back late in last season. You know, I think he missed the first week or two, struggled to hit when he came back. And so he's a guy that they felt like had a lot of potential, but just through circumstances had never gotten really a chance to play consistently. He's hitting seventh in the opening day lineup. He's just hit all year for them. And I got a chance to speak with him yesterday. He credited Mike Baxter with some things in his approach. I mean, obviously being healthy has helped him, but obviously there were some other things that he's done to improve his game. He said he's doing a better job of laying off pitches, bad pitches that maybe he doesn't want to hit, that he's hacked at in the past, that he's just letting go by. But that's a kid who is really crushing it for Vanderbilt. And I think if it's not for Wes Clark, he might be the story in the league, because I don't think that's a name that anybody knew unless they specifically followed Vanderbilt. But I think he's a kid who is going to be in that discussion on the very short list of best hitters in the league after we end the year, just because I've seen his approach. It's good. The ability's always been there. And to me, in terms of individual surprises, he's certainly got to be at the top of the list, because I wasn't sure, even having seen him play, what they'd get, but I've just been super impressed.
Well, his numbers are certainly good. I mean, 12 out of 21 to start the year, and 9 of his 12 hits are extra base hits. I mean, he's got 3 singles, 5 doubles, a triple, and 3 home runs. He's got more walks and strikeouts, 13 RBI, and 21 at bats. I think I had this correct. The OPS is almost 2,000. He's got a 571 average, a 679 on base percentage, and a 1333 slugging percentage, you know, in their lineup. And they always have guys, you know, people talk about Vanderbilt hitting, but Vanderbilt's always had good offenses as well. And I think Gonzalez coming back this year is going to, playing as well as he is going to help them this year. But yeah, I have not seen Vanderbilt play yet. I am excited to see Keegan play. I've heard a lot of really good things about him. His numbers are incredible. I'm really looking forward to, you know, getting some eyes on them and seeing them play, here in the near future. But Keegan is certainly somebody that I'm interested in taking a look at.
Well, Blake, you've certainly seen Vanderbilt play a lot too. And again, Blake and I live in Nashville. Barry lives in Tuscaloosa. But Blake, I think you've had a chance to see Rocker and Leiter both pitch. And SEC fans know the name Kumar Rocker, and they probably know the name Jack Leiter, but they haven't seen him yet. Leiter is starting to pop up ahead of Rocker in number 1 overall conversations. In fact, I've seen it a couple times now. Some people think he will be the number 1 pick. I think that's premature, but certainly his stuff has been phenomenal. And again, we've seen him pitch better than we've seen him pitch better this year. But that race between those two guys, just to see who's the best guy on the Vandy staff, is going to be really fascinating to watch.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch. It will not be fascinating for other opponents in the SEC, because like we said, I think you put those two guys up against anyone and you feel like you've got a chance just based on how they're pitching. And like you said too, I mean, they've got the good problem of, you know, who's going to be number 1. Like one of these guys, it's just, you've got 2 guys that are to that level. And it's different, man. And we've talked about it before in terms of just the command they have, just what they can do with the ball. It's just, it's incredible to think that there are 2 guys like this at their age who can do this. Of course, we've seen Vanderbilt have guys come through over the years, and you can go up and down the line for different guys who have made it. David Price, and just again, there's so many to name that we'd probably need to extend our podcast 30 minutes. But it's just one of those things where, when you have 2 guys like that going into a series, a normal 3-game series, it's one of those things to where you are facing a disadvantage if you're the opponent, just knowing that being able to kind of crack what those two guys can do is not going to be easy. And like you said, just watching them here, in Nashville through these games they played thus far, I don't think anything sort of changes your mind about them from a pitching standpoint, other than the fact that, they're good and we thought they were going to be good, but my goodness, like they could be better than we thought they were going to be just from in terms of what they do pitching wise. So that's going to make it pretty fascinating to watch and see how, I think the fun part of it, Chris, is, who do they open up SEC play with? Like they open up with South Carolina, who, as we said, has really been putting the bat on the ball. So I think that's going to be fun just to kind of see where those two teams out here in a couple weeks.
Yeah, and Blake, I have been trying to get together a power ranking in my head of SEC baseball, which I intended to publish by now, but frankly, I can't make up my mind, right? Because there are 5 or 6 teams, I think, maybe in that discussion, and something could make me look like an idiot in a week if I put it out there. I just don't think the body of work, again, that we have is great, but frankly, I would have put Ole Miss and Florida ahead of Vandy in the pecking order to start the year. But just the dynamic with the way those kids are hitting the ball pretty well. Now, they had some struggles some games, but you're starting to see the bats come around, and then you throw Rocker and Leiter in the equation. Oh, by the way, their bullpen's deeper than it's ever been, I think, and their number 3 starter, who is Thomas Schultz, is also really good. And if it's not Schultz, it's going to end up being Sam Leboke, who's also terrific and, frankly, I think better than Schultz. But I'm starting to suspect Vanderbilt might be the best team in the league, but I really think that series with them in Oklahoma State in Stillwater in 2 weekends, I'm kind of trying to suspend judgment until then, but I think Vandy may sneak into that number 1 overall best team in the league conversation after that point if they can hit OSU really well in that park. I'm kind of trying to suspend judgment, but I'm starting to think that team might be a little better than I thought going into the year.
Yeah, I mean, you want to be the complete package to be able to win it all. But if you, like we've said, if you have Rocker and you have Leiter and you have the pitching you don't have to be perfect all the time with your bats, because that, when those guys are on the mound, there are times where maybe you only have to score, 4 or 5 runs maybe to be able to win these types of games. And, we saw that in that 5-4 game against Georgia State. Of course, some of the others, as we talked about, they scored double digits. But even going back to that second game against Wright State that they win 1-0, those probably are not going to be, you're not going to see, I guess, a lot of 1-0 games probably in some of these SEC type caliber games against, someone like South Carolina. But at the end of the day, like you're giving yourself a chance to not always have to be perfect with the bats, just because the pitching is going to take care of itself. And like you mentioned, I think we'll kind of learn more too, probably about, the bullpen and those types of things in some of those games against teams like Oklahoma State and South Carolina to kick things off in SEC play. So, I'm very fascinated to see kind of how those teams set themselves apart. We've talked about it, guys. That's been the theme. We've tried to figure out what separates Vanderbilt from Arkansas, from Ole Miss, from Mississippi State, from all these other teams just a couple weeks into the season. It's really hard to know right now, but as we get closer here, and again, we're 2 weeks away from the start of SEC play, I think things start to kind of figure themselves out a bit, and especially for Vanderbilt, that series at Oklahoma State next week, I think that'll be a big sort of point to be able to kind of discuss maybe where they're at before the start of SEC play.
All right, let's close this thing out. Barry, I will throw it back to you for just a moment in case you've got any news, notes, thoughts that we didn't get to in the podcast. I'll let you start, then we'll let Blake do it, and we'll finish up here.
Well, I wanted to talk about Vanderbilt. Y'all were talking about their pitching, and you talking about Rocker and Leiter, could very well be the number 1 and number 2 pitcher in the league. And you got a scenario where, hey, how'd you do? Well, I was the second best pitcher in my conference. Oh, well, that's pretty cool. He said, but I was also the second best pitcher on my team, because the other guy on my team was better. I mean, they've got 29 strikeouts in 19 innings and haven't given up an earned run. And as Blake was talking about them, I thought about a game I was watching on TV years ago, and Chris Berman was doing a game on ESPN, and the Orioles were playing. And they showed a shot in the stands of Frank Robinson. And Chris Berman goes, wow, there's a guy. He said, man, that guy could really hit. He said one of the all-time great gentlemen, one of the all-time great players in Major League Baseball history. But he can't even win his letter. And I'm thinking, where is he going with this? And he goes, he read out his home runs and all this stuff. He goes, he not even have the most home runs with a guy whose last name begins with the letter R. He goes, that belongs to some guy named George Herman Babe Ruth. And so you talk about almost 200 home run difference between. I mean, that's how good. I'm not saying that Rocker and Leiter or Babe Ruth and Frank Robinson, major league type guys, but I mean, that's just kind of what you think. What I thought about when Blake was talking about those two guys, Frank Robinson and Babe Ruth popped up. Yeah, hit the second most home runs. Well, who was first? Well, some guy named Babe Ruth that hit 714. So, and another thing that looks out is Arkansas. I mean, they're 7-0. They could be 14-0 when they get into SEC play against Alabama. I mean, they play Murray State this weekend. They will have a tough road series at Louisiana Tech next week. We'll touch on this a little bit more next week, but Louisiana Tech in a 6-day span are going to host Arkansas and Ole Miss at home 5 games. Tremendous boost for Louisiana Tech and getting Arkansas and Ole Miss to come to town and play in Ruston in a new stadium that was torn up last year because of the tornadoes. And I mean, their stadium or not last year, but 2 years ago, totally destroyed. Last year they played what few games they got to play. They played at high school games and high school fields because they didn't have a place to play, and they have a new place now. And we'll get into that a little bit next week. But Arkansas just, pitching, defense, games where they have to score runs, games where they have to have a walk-off, games where they have to come from behind. They've kind of done it all. I mean, they've hit a ton of home runs this year. Peyton Pallette has pitched really well. He's really the only starter that's done it consistently for them in the first 2 weeks of the season. You're talking about power rankings and stuff. I'm still split between Vanderbilt and Arkansas as 1-2 in the league right now for that. Probably a little edge to Vanderbilt because they're way more deeper on the mound in starting pitching. And an interesting thing, and just looking at the schedule, if Arkansas is the best team in the West and Vanderbilt's the best team in the East, they don't play each other. So you won't see Vanderbilt and Arkansas play during the regular season. You'd have to wait to Hoover. So, but those two teams kind of jump out right now as we get into week 3 of the season.
Blake, I'll throw it to you. One thing we didn't mention, Vanderbilt and Cincinnati scheduled a game on Monday. That'll be played tonight. I don't know that it really moves the needle for much of anybody other than those two programs. But the Commodores, I think a smart move to get in a game. I think Jerry Stackhouse is trying to get his kids some experience. They missed some games for COVID. So there is a little bit of unexpected SEC basketball on tap tonight. So I'll throw it to you. You can comment on that or anything else we didn't get to today as we close the show.
Yeah, like you said, that's nothing wrong with some Thursday night basketball in the SEC, but it's just it's a game. We talked about it. I think it's good for both teams. You just play more games. Why not? You haven't played your normal allotment this year, so go ahead and play some more. But no, we'll talk about Saturday's matchups and all that, I'm sure, on tomorrow's podcast on Friday. But as always, check out everything we got going on over at southeastern14.com. I know, Barry's got his recap up from baseball yesterday and just a lot of great stuff. And I know, Chris, we're working on a lot of stuff to continue to add to it as well. And just be sure to check everything out on there. As I mentioned, the poll too. Our poll was a hit on Twitter for our SEC Basketball Player of the Year. 500 or so votes thus far. So you can check that out over at 14 Southeastern on Twitter.
Yeah, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Again, check out the site at southeastern14.com. What you see now is a preview of some more things to come. The site is being built out to do some other pretty cool things that we will announce later in the spring. Of course, follow us on Twitter at 14 Southeastern, and rate and review, subscribe to the podcast, which we do Monday through Friday at the place where you get your podcasts. In any case, Blake and I will be back tomorrow. We'll talk some SEC hoops heading into the weekend and whatever else is news. Thank you for listening to the 14. For Blake Lovell and Barry Allen, I'm your host, Chris Lee. We will see you again with another episode on Friday.